Good evening. It's on? Okay. I don't think so. We didn't know how to turn it on.
I see it.
Okay.
Volume not like it was when I was it? We're getting returning up.
Okay.
Okay, you can stand it. Hey guys, if I could have your attention please and we could all get seated.
Thank you.
And it's good. You might just need to speak up a little bit. The speakers are a little bit quieter than normal.
Okay.
They get it set because it's a church.
Thank you. Good evening, folks. We're about to get started. Please grab yourself some food and have a seat. Oh.
That needs the Spanish
Okay.
interpretation, but we'll keep it handy in case.
Okay.
All right?
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for coming this evening. My name is Sally Hoyt. I'm part of the Stormwater staff for the city. I hope you've enjoyed interacting with the staff from Stormwater and Planning and Sustainability who came out tonight to share about those programs. A couple of housekeeping items. As I think you've all seen, we have food available, so help yourselves. I also want to let you know where the restrooms are. If you go out the door in the back, the main door, and turn to your left, you'll find men's and women's rooms. The event this evening is part of a series of community conversations for Reflecting Raleigh, the next comprehensive plan. This is the plan that guides how Raleigh grows and evolves as a city for the next 20 years. So we really want your feedback and your input into that. And the feedback you provide will help inform the vision and goals for that comprehensive plan. Tonight, we'll be hearing from Ted Brown, who's an outside expert who's going to help us generate ideas related to stormwater. If you want to learn more about the city's stormwater programs, you can join us next Monday, December 9th, right here in this room, to hear from Reverend Jermon Taylor, the chair of our Stormwater Management Advisory Commission, and Wayne Miles, who's the Stormwater Program Administrator. There will also be an opportunity as part of that event to provide input directly to city staff and have that recorded as part of the official public input. If you got your program as you checked in, that has a QR code to a survey that will be open through the end of January as another means to give feedback. For tonight, if you have any questions for our speaker, there are brightly colored sticky notes in each aisle. Please write your questions on those sticky notes and pass them to the outside of the room, and they will get to the question taker. I'm now going to introduce our speaker. Ted Brown is a water resources engineer, a Carolina grad, and the current president and CEO of Biohabitats, which is an ecological restoration firm headquartered in Baltimore, Maryland. Ted has over 30 years of experience in the stormwater field, doing everything from watershed planning to site-specific stormwater designs. Ted served on expert panels, and he's trained and mentored many stormwater professionals. That includes me. That's why I'm doing this introduction. Ted and I met 20 years ago when he was my supervisor at the nonprofit Center for Watershed Protection. So now, please welcome Ted Brown.
Thanks, Sally, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here this evening. I know everybody's got busy schedules, so I appreciate you taking time out of your evening to listen to some of the things I'm going to try and share with us tonight. I'm going to try and work the slideshow. I've got a mouse here, but Bill, it's not advancing. So I don't know if I need a little bit of help. The mouse isn't advancing the slides. It was earlier when we test drove this thing. Well, I'm going to try and start anyhow. What I'm going to try and cover this evening is a little bit of a history of stormwater management programs kind of in the country. So to give you a broader perspective, talk a little bit about what the city of Raleigh is doing as far as their stormwater program, and then trying to push the envelope a little bit of what might we be thinking about to advance our current state of the practice. Some of these things are being done in other parts of the country. We probably need to do a better job all around to do better when it comes to managing the rainwater that's falling on our landscapes, and to think about it a little bit differently than we do. Still don't have action going. Now we do. Thank you. Okay, so here's what I'm going to try and...
I'll grab that mouse from you, and if you just say next slide.
I got it going now.
Okay, you got it?
Yeah, thank you, though. So this is what we'll try and cover, and I'll end with some ending remarks that I hope will be a little bit inspirational, a little bit aspirational, and maybe you can let me know what you think about that. Now, we all know, particularly in the state of North Carolina, the devastation that comes with extreme events. Hurricane Helene is very close to our memories, and we probably know a lot of people that were impacted significantly by that event. And these are happening more and more frequently and having greater and greater impacts. And it's tragic what we see. But there are much smaller events happening every year, much smaller rainfall events that happen every year that cause other types of harm. They erode our stream banks. They transport pollutants into our waterways and impair our estuaries, our streams, our rivers, our lakes. We have impacts of nuisance flooding from those smaller events. So there's water quality impacts, there's ecological and habitat impacts, as well as the devastation from those large events. And we really are dealing with a challenge where historically we tried to engineer against nature rather than maybe thinking more differently about it these days of designing and engineering with nature, in concert with nature, so that we're working together. And some of you may have seen these cartoon types of diagrams that show as we manipulate the landscape, as we change the land cover and put down harder surface, clear the vegetation so the tree canopy isn't as significant as it was, we end up adjusting that rainfall runoff response so that how many people have walked during a rainstorm through a closed canopy forest cover and barely gotten wet because of that canopy cover, compared to if you're walking in the downtown streets of Raleigh and you're going to get soaking wet. And so that rainfall runoff response is dramatically adjusted as we manipulate the landscape. And it's not just the urbanization. It also happens in the agricultural setting. When we clear, and all for good reasons, to provide for food sources for our communities, we still are manipulating that landscape, and we cause pollutants to run off, to impair our streams and waterways as a result of that. So it's a cascade of challenges that are generated as we manipulate the landscape, and then we try to harness nature and what it wants to do quite often. So we've been doing this for a long time, trying to harness nature. It goes back decades, centuries. You know, there was the great flood of the Mississippi in 1927 where we were trying to control the Mississippi and it said, heck no. And it busted out of its banks and caused devastation. There's a book called Rising Tide about that shows a dichotomy of approaches of, hey, we can contain it and engineer it to do what we want it to do, to no, let's give it a relief path to the west and allow it to flow over some open land and not cause as much damage. It's an interesting book, and I would recommend you all take a look at it if you find this interesting. So we've tried to control those large floods by damming up our rivers, impacting, again, those natural waterways, and trying to create protective reservoirs from those flood damages. We channelized the systems, over-engineered them. We then went to a philosophy of pipe it and then pave over it. So we put the water in a pipe, we discharge it to a stream out of sight, out of the way, and then we build over it. There's lots of streams that are buried, not only in the city of Raleigh, but all across the country, that are degraded and impacted and impaired because of that. We then kind of got a little bit smarter. In the early 1970s, the Clean Water Act was passed. 1972, we started thinking more locally about managing stormwater runoff. We built these things called dry detention ponds. Maybe they served as fields in parks. Maybe they had other uses, and they would hold the water and then bleed it out, primarily a flood control purpose. We then advanced our thinking and thinking that, hey, we've got a water quality issue. In the early 1980s, there was an effort underway that was called NURP. NURP was the acronym, Nationwide Urban Runoff Program. And so the large municipalities across the country monitored their stormwater quality and found to be high in pollutants, and that it was impairing all of our waterways. And so there was an awakening of sorts that we need to pay attention to our water quality because our water resources, our streams, our lakes are being impaired because of this uncontrolled and untreated runoff that was discharging to these systems. And so we started developing new technology, wet ponds where we were treating the first flush, thinking that's how we were going to treat the water quality. And it was a good effort at the time. There was no regulatory structure at the time. So in the early 90s, we started a permit program for large municipalities greater than 100,000 people. Now, this is a mouthful of alphabet stew for you. It was the NPDES MS4 permit, the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System Municipal Separate Storm Source System permit. And the phase 1 portion of that permit targeted those large municipalities. And that was rolled out in the 1990s. And we'll go over some of the components of those permits. Then in the 2000s, EPA, and that's where these permit systems generally initiated, and then it filtered down to the states and local governments being the ones that had the permit that needed to be met. We introduced the phase 2. So these were smaller urbanized areas. So that might be like a Durham, North Carolina, whereas Raleigh being a phase 1 NPDES permittee. The phase 2s didn't quite have as much teeth in those permits as the phase 1s and not as heavy sticks in those permits, but they were still required to do some of the minimum measures that we'll review in a moment. And then we started slowly advancing and saying, we're still not doing as well as we need to. Our waters are still impaired. We started hearing things like low impact development. That's been around now for maybe 20 years. How many people have heard of LID or low impact development? Another term that's very similar is better site design. I'll use that in a while again. And now the phrase of the day tends to be environmental site design. A lot of the same principles involved in all of those three things: low impact development, better site design, environmental site design, about being more holistic in how we think about managing rainwater and doing it at the planning level initially, all the way through a whole series of a development and growth cycle. And we'll review that in a moment. So the programs typically were at a base level comprised of 6 what they called minimum measures. And that included things like better housekeeping, public education, pollution prevention, erosion and sediment control, stewardship, and post-construction stormwater management, without any really specificity. It was like, do the best you can kind of things, and just demonstrate that you were making progress or you were doing something, scratching the earth to say you could check that box. Some of the more progressive permits of the time might have had a reference to meeting what were called and are called total maximum daily loads, TMDLs. So when our waterways get impaired, they get listed. And then when they are listed on what's called the 303D list, and that's all a reference to the Clean Water Act, then you need to develop a plan to say, how are you going to take this sick body of water and make it healthy? And so some of these stormwater permits had written into them that the local jurisdictions, the municipalities, had to start taking measures to address and start making progress towards some of those TMDLs. We have them here. We've got the Neuse Basin with a TMDL. We've got Falls Lake. We've got Jordan Lake. You probably have seen that in the news over the last decade to 15 years probably. That has been in the conversation. And it's ebbed and flowed based on what the appetite is probably in the Raleigh State House for enforcing some of those rules. And so it can get complicated. It can generate disputes because who's paying for this is a big part of the conversation. But it's been around for a while, and that component of a permit is more of a stick element, and more progressive permits might have a requirement to start addressing some of those watershed-based impairments that we need to get after and improve and show improvement. Some of the more progressive permits yet still had provisions in them like the state of Maryland, where the phase 1 permittees had to address their untreated, unaddressed stormwater runoff. And that's from the older development. So before stormwater regulations came into play in the 1990s, well, guess what? A lot of Raleigh existed before stormwater regulations were in place, and there is no stormwater addressing the runoff from any of that developed area. All across the country, same thing. And so in Maryland, the phase 1 permittees, in the rollout of the latest generation permit back in the late 90s, they had to address 15% of their untreated impervious surface in their jurisdictional area, each 5-year permit cycle. So that's a heavy stick, okay? So think about that. You might have thousands of acres of untreated, developed land, and you've got to go in there as a jurisdiction and retrofit all of that. You've got to squeeze in stormwater practices, stormwater control measures in spaces that are tight to try and treat that. But Maryland communities have been doing that for probably 20 years. So there is precedent for doing it and actually having some success of meeting those permit requirements. We're probably in, I don't know what Raleigh's permit generation is offhand, but in some places that have had the first round of phase 1 permits, they're probably in their 7th or 8th generation of their permit. And each permit, they're typically 5 years, although the permitting agencies tend to lag behind, so sometimes those permits last for 8 years. But they're 5-year permits, generally speaking. And each permit cycle, the regulating agency, and so again, it might be DEQ, right? Or in Maryland, the Maryland Department of Environment. They're going to turn the screws a little bit more each time. This is great. You all did a reasonably good job. We're going to ask you to do a little bit more. And so they accelerate the request on that watershed restoration component. And they say, not only do you just need to scratch the earth, dirt on the TMDL requirement, we actually want you to demonstrate specific progress towards the pollution reduction goals that are set forth in that regulatory document. So in a 5-year permit cycle, it might say you need to meet 15% of the reduction in that first 5 year. And then in the next 5 year, you need to meet another 40%. And then in the next permit cycle, you need to meet the balance. So the requirements start to get a little bit more significant, a little bit harder to achieve, requiring new thought processes, innovation, collaboration. We'll talk about some of the things that needed to go on and are going on. It requires interagency coordination. You got to do a bunch of annual reporting, monitoring to see how are we doing in terms of making progress towards water quality goals. How are we doing today in terms of the resiliency need of being able to mitigate flood impacts? And what are we doing for that? Are we inspecting our new set of assets? We have all this green stormwater infrastructure or stormwater control measures. That's an asset class that we now need to take care of. And so we have an obligation to maintain and upkeep the performance of these facilities. And we need to enforce those things. All of that takes a bunch of different capabilities. Well, so how's the city of Raleigh doing? And Wayne will probably show you a slide, either this slide or a slide similar to it, next Monday on December 9th when he gives a talk. And I think the city of Raleigh has a lot to be proud of. They have done a really nice job of integrating a lot of these really important elements, some of which aren't explicit in their permit. Some of them are just common sense and things that they've learned over time and know that they feed into each other. And it's like a continuous feedback loop. And you need to do a little bit of progress in all of these areas for that whole system to work. So it's like a spider web, right? If you neglect an area, that spider web will fall in and be not a full, complete matrix, right? So all of these parts have to be working together for that whole program to work effectively. And the city's done a pretty good job. Can they do better? You bet. Do they know they can do better? You bet. And are they looking at ways to do better? You bet. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes a lot of different things. It's hard. It's really hard. There's a lot of challenges. You've got to get buy-in by elected officials. You need the permitting agencies to be on their game, efficient, timely. You need procurement processes that are innovative and creative and nimble and flexible. You need new technology. You need to be able to adapt and embrace and allow for new technologies. And people are nervous about that. What if it fails? Learn from it, get better, and and make an improvement and improve the technology. And you need money. There's no doubt about it. You need resources. And there's different ways to acquire money. Right now, the city has a stormwater utility. That's a fantastic way to build a base load of a program. You can go get grant dollars from the feds, from the state, and improve your program. The city is doing that. So you've got to be creative. And then you partner with NGOs and you team and you do creative, innovative things to meet all these permit obligations. And you do it in a collaborative and an integrated manner so that you don't silo out your city departments. Rec and Parks is working with the Stormwater Group, that is working with DOT, that is working with the Department of Education. All those pieces work together to achieve your program goals and outcomes. Is there a limit? Some people might say yes, there is, in terms of like our water quality end goals. So like we're pretty good engineers, but again, Mother Nature beats us up pretty well as well. But we can engineer up to a certain point. So we can build that mousetrap, and hopefully it's a nature-based mousetrap to treat the runoff from the landscape, to slow it down, and to meet some baseline condition that we aspire to get to, a forest condition or a rural condition. This slide's pretty hard to see. I'm going to go off mic. I'll try and talk loud. But these horizontal lines, the bottom one is the forest baseload, then the next one up is the rural baseload. This is nitrogen loading up the y-axis and impervious cover in the sub-watershed on the horizontal x-axis. So basically what it's saying, if I don't do anything to treat the runoff, I can maybe get up to about 10% impervious cover before I exceed the way the forest performs in terms of managing that runoff, right? But if I use the best technology that's out there, which is that black line where it says with STPs and BSD, stormwater treatment practices is STPs, BSD is better site design. I can get out to maybe 40% impervious surface to achieve that rural loading condition, but only about 20% impervious cover to mimic that forest condition. There's noise in that data, but just like as a general rule of thumb, that's something to think about. So there's a limit to our capabilities and how good we are. And that might suggest that there might be value in protecting our highest quality watersheds and conserving land, and directing growth in other areas that are maybe already impacted, impaired, and manage those resources as impacted and impaired resources, which means you don't neglect them, but you manage them and you do things a little bit differently than in the highest quality watersheds. So there's different ways to do some of these things, and there are success stories out there. Things, and I'll talk a little bit more about all these things, from watershed-based approaches to different ways to deliver a project to a community, to the partnerships, to the funding mechanisms, to relying on community members. You coming out, caring about this enough to be engaged and to be a voice in the community, to promote certain types of approaches, to challenge approaches, but do it in a spirit of cooperation to make our overall community better. So watershed planning, you all are already doing this. Walnut Creek, a lot of watershed planning has been going on there. This is kind of good stuff because you can think about that unit, that's a planning unit. The ideal size is like 10 square miles and smaller. So you break a bigger watershed up into smaller units and you plan at a manageable unit where you can piece together projects, both structural and non-structural initiatives to achieve outcomes at that local small watershed scale. And you can really see improvement over time. It's harder to see improvement at a larger scale. So at the Neuse Basin River, the Neuse River Basin scale, it's harder to see progress. It'll take a longer amount of time. It's still possible, and you're working towards that, but you're going to see better signs of progress at a smaller scale. You can prioritize and you can dedicate specific resources to achieve those outcomes. Now, it can be done at a big scale, and a good example is Chesapeake Bay, an huge multi-state economic engine. I'm right in the middle of it in the state of Maryland. So it's super important to the state of Maryland's economy. And so the Chesapeake Bay has a TMDL, a total maximum daily load. It's a pollution diet. And we have to reduce the amount of nutrients and sediment that are going to the Chesapeake Bay if we're going to make it healthy. And each jurisdiction and each permittee has a specific requirement that they need to meet. And it's got a sunset. This is the difference with the Chesapeake Bay TMDL. It's got a sunset on it. It's got a 2025 deadline that you need to meet it by. Are we going to meet it? I'm afraid not, but we're trying to, and maybe we'll adjust that sunset. But we're all working towards, all the permittees are working towards meeting that pollution diet by those time frames. That's the hammer that we try to live by, and I think that's needed. Climate change, it's real, it's here, we're experiencing it, and it can be catastrophic, as we know, as we talked about earlier. Well, we should address it head on, and again, there's data out there, and there's jurisdictions that are adjusting how they plan, how they design, taking into account climate change. So these are data that are generated by an effort under NOAA. The effort's MRISA, which is the Mid-Atlantic Regional Integrated Sciences and, what does that say, Assessments. That's the acronym. And so they looked out into the future and said, our rainfall depths are increasing for a given design storm. Design storms are what we tend to plan around and design our stormwater control measures for. And so 5 years ago, the 10-year, and I don't know these exactly, so I'm making up the numbers. Our 10-year design storm might have been 8 inches here. In 2050, if you use the MRISA data, and the MRISA data doesn't go as far south as North Carolina, but I'm guessing there's some adjusted climate data that is available for the state of North Carolina. But that same storm in 2050 is probably 8.6 inches. So it's a bigger storm for that same return frequency. That means we would have to design our practices to be larger, to accommodate and manage more water that would run off. That's smart planning to do that, though. We need to use all the tools available to us when we plan. We need to do great land use planning. That's part of this effort under the comprehensive plan that's underway by the city of Raleigh right now. We need to think about land conservation, setting off our most pristine, our highest quality lands, and maintain that as high quality open space. Setting aside buffers to our streams, wetlands, coastal areas where it applies. Doing the things like the environmental site design, addressing erosion sediment control at construction sites, post-construction stormwater management, dry weather flows. That's one of the easiest things to control. Get your illicit discharge out of the system. That improves water quality really easily. And then stewardship, educate the public. Get them conversant in the topic, not afraid of it, but thinking about it and understanding how it impacts and influences the community. So the land use planning, preserve natural areas, slow down, break up the runoff, beneficially use the rainfall, capture it, reuse it, use it to support landscapes, use it to support floodplain ecologies, use distributed practice across the landscape, mimic natural hydrology. These are all parts of different types of planning approaches. Rainwater harvesting, incorporating green stormwater infrastructure elements into open space. We were talking earlier about Smoky Hollow. How many people are familiar with the efforts underway at Smoky Hollow in the city? An open space area that's not only going to be open space for respite, contemplation, passive recreation, but it's going to be a stormwater management facility. You won't know it if it's done really well. It's going to be holding, infiltrating, using the landscape to soak up that water and to attenuate those flows so that downstream flows are lower and smaller and not causing as much nuisance flooding. Stream restoration, I know that's been a source of conversation here locally where stream banks are being eroded. Where possible, we're really advancing stream restoration in the practice to think about floodplain reconnection, allowing the water where it has the opportunity to access its rightful right-of-way. That floodplain, give it access. We've too often encroached on the floodplains, and that's forced the water into a narrow path. All that water has energy that it's got to unleash. It erodes the stream channel, carries that sediment and those other pollutants downstream. If we give access, so this is an intentional design. This is called a zero-order stream restoration project, where we want that water spread out to slow it down, to allow it to soak into the floodplain and to be beneficially used by the different floodplain ecologies. Sometimes you have more constrained space. This is Unity Park in Greenville, South Carolina, where flood condition, where it's intentional to have those floodwaters get out into the floodplain. Within 24 hours, that floodwaters profile is subsided. That floodplain did part of its job, of its intended job, in an already constrained area. Could you do a better project than this? Maybe, but there's constraints. You have to balance all those things when you're thinking about all of your options. We've got lots of examples of eroded gullies from stormwater outfalls. All that sediment, that's me standing in that channel. It's probably, I don't know, 18 feet high, 16 feet high. I like to say I'm 6 foot, but I'm not really. I'm like 5'11". But all of that sediment gets washed downstream. We can use innovative practices like regenerative stormwater conveyance that not only prevents further degradation and erosion of that channel, that gully, but it also can treat the runoff draining to it. So instead of putting a pipe in that gully and piping it straight to the stream, maybe use a natural-based system approach to slow the water down, to filter it, and to prevent future degradation of the gully. Being innovative and creative, floating wetlands and lakes and ponds. From a water quality standpoint, maybe not doing a whole lot to move the needle, but they're interesting. They pique curiosity. They get people to say, wow, what is that? Why is it there? That looks kind of cool. That's pretty. I like that. Engagement, getting people to be better educated about what you're trying to achieve. Sorry about my jittery hand on the mouse wheel. This is Mr. Trash Wheel. Anybody heard of Mr. Trash Wheel? So this is, from my fair city, Charm City, Baltimore City, one of the inventions that came into the Baltimore Inner Harbor. And it gets great publicity. He has his own website. We've got Mrs. Trash Wheel, and I think we have a Professor Trash Wheel now. And there's something like 8 of them around the globe because of just the innovation of being solar powered, of cleaning up the trash. There are trash TMDLs out there where you can't have any trash load into the Baltimore Harbor. So Mr. Trash Wheel helps that TMDL be met. It's not perfect, but it's super interesting and fun and engaging. The kids love it, and the general public loves it. I'm going to now transition to how do we deliver all these projects. And I think that's one of the things that from the public sector side, the city side, we've got to be looking at, of different ways that we can get projects completed, maybe lowering the public sector's risk, transferring it to other parties, and achieving innovative outcomes as a result. I'll go through a handful of different ways to deliver projects. And I apologize if you can't read. You think it's hard to read. Like, I thought I was going to have a laptop up in front of me, and Bill's like, sorry, I'm up here with Bill, and we're like, this is like the eye doctor, when you go down the screen. And I'm like, I'm blind. My eyes are terrible. And I'm like, I got the alternate delivery part here, and I got hard copy here, but I can't read any of this. But anyhow, Prince George's County, Maryland is probably gets a lot of notoriety for their public-private partnership. They did it with Corvius, and Corvius created this entity called the Clean Water Partnership. And that was turnkey, that this third party, this private entity, took on the responsibility of a good chunk of Prince George's County's responsibility of implementing green stormwater infrastructure countywide. Now, they carved out, I think it was mostly targeting right-of-way practices, but this partnership was responsible for the funding, the design, the maintenance, the construction of all of that. And then they had a contract with the county that said, if you deliver it to us according to these performance standards, we'll pay you. And there might have been a tiered structure with incentives that if you deliver it faster, we'll pay you a premium. If you deliver it so it performs at a higher level, we'll pay you a premium. That's something to think about. There's pay for performance. It's a little bit different. This is when a county, and this is Anne Arundel County, Maryland, might put out an RFP that says, we need 2,000 nutrient credits, 2,000 pounds of nutrients removed from the system. You need to do it according to these accepted practices. We don't care where you do it. You can do it on private land, but you need to finance it. You need to design it, build it, and maintain it for X years, 5 years, 10 years, and you need to monitor it to prove that it's working. And then if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, we'll pay you what we agreed to for that duck. And this has been very successful for Anne Arundel County. Their staff doesn't have to manage and oversee because all they have to do is wait for the delivery of that product that meets these performance standards. It's transferring the risk. It's a little bit like mitigation banking, but it's not the same. Mitigation banking, which North Carolina has a lot of experience with, is more speculative. This is a defined need. You enter into a contract, so as the third party, the private sector delivering it, you know that if you meet these performance standards, you will get paid. Mitigation banking is more speculative than that. It's a nuance, but I hope you can understand that. Design build, another way to transfer the risk from the public sector to the private sector, still a little bit different. So this is where the public sector is still financing and paying for the work either in a phased basis or maybe milestone payments. But on the private sector side, typically private sector, you're agreeing that we're not only going to design it, we're going to build it, we're going to maintain it, so you don't have to worry about construction oversight, you don't have to worry about the bidding process, and we are on the hook to deliver to you a project that meets the requirements that are specified in the contract. This is great model for ecological restoration, which is complex. There's a lot of field adjustments. Good contractors are really smart, and they're like, hey, if we do this, we could have a better project. And as a designer, I'm working with the contractor, said, that's brilliant, you know? I love that idea, because we're working in partnership. If we both work together cooperatively, we're going to have a better product, and the client, the jurisdiction, Raleigh in this case, is going to be happier with that outcome under that model. We have a lot of success with that in the ecological restoration field, and it's done on all kinds of infrastructure projects as well. External partnerships are also important. This is more like on the workforce development, the Green Jobs Initiative. Can you partner with other organizations to get youth in the summertime to maintain some of that green stormwater infrastructure? Can you come up with sustainable programs to help new businesses get off the ground and have external partnerships that way? We need to up the game in monitoring assessment. Look at where we are. What is it? We're in the research triangle. So many talented stormwater practitioners and research scientists in this area doing phenomenal work, and many of you are working with them. Leverage that. I mean, continue to leverage it and build those relationships and get that positive feedback loop of, hey, we did this. Is it working? Should we tweak the design? Should we tweak the way we delivered the project? Learn, get better, always have that positive feedback loop. I mentioned assets earlier. So we're building a whole new community of assets, these green stormwater infrastructure, these nature-based practices. It's a whole new asset class, and we have kind of neglected an appreciation and thought that, oh, we can build it and leave it alone. Not so fast. We've got to be there to maintain it, to treat it like any other asset that we would do in a municipal setting. And so we need to finance that. We need to track it in relational databases so we know its age, when it needs routine maintenance, maybe when it needs a major overhaul. Once it's 20 years old, we might need to replace some things. Once it's 10 years old, we might need to freshen it up a little bit. City of Raleigh is doing a nice job here. Can we do better? Yes, but I think we're going to do better. We're going to use AI for this kind of stuff, and it'll be more efficient, more streamlined, better data, better ability to crunch the data, and a positive feedback loop. So the last kind of chunk of the talk that I really want to try to pivot from is all that I was talking about was kind of programmatic. It was kind of a little bit boring almost, but you got to do it to be in compliance. I think we need to think about all that we're doing a little bit differently, almost turn it on its head. And what I was saying before is think about nature as a partner and with a seat at the table, quite literally. Think about what would nature do more than we do currently. And we can think about it in lots of different layers and contexts. We're doing a lot of work in the urban ecology realm, and that's just looking at our urban areas and thinking about the open space and the natural areas and the connectivity, and how can we build green networks so that not only our native species can find ways to migrate and get around, but also humans, that we're able to get to quality open space so that we can enjoy our lives and that we can be healthy and that we can be contemplative. And I think it's really useful to think about what was there before we were here, before we modified the landscape. There's a cool project called Manhattan. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that the right way or not, but that's Manhattan, right? The indigenous term for Manhattan. And think about what was Manhattan before it is what it is today. And there are some remnants, you know, if you're lucky enough to visit Central Park, where you can see some of those original native landscapes. But I think we're all communities ultimately. And I think we've got to push away from these more conventional practices that are energy sinks, generating carbon, and sustainable, like just net zero isn't good enough either. It's better than what we typically do. We've got to get into the regenerative principle. We got to start giving back and creating spaces that, yeah, maybe it's managing water beneficially and meeting permit requirements, but really what it needs to start doing is creating more habitat, creating better spaces for us to enjoy and to experience, creating higher levels of biodiversity. And we know that it's doable. There's examples, there are plans out there. Atlanta has an urban ecology framework that we supported. City of Baltimore has a green network plan. I think Raleigh has elements of these type of open space networks that are knit together into mosaics and matrices. We need to realize that those natural areas are providing the ecosystem services that we're benefiting from. Provisioning, cultural, whether it's recreational, whether it's health, regulating nutrients, regulating energy, and supporting things like habitat. My boss really hits the mantra of if we create a lot more biodiversity, all the ecosystem services come easily. So don't focus on the ecosystem services. Focus on creating as much biodiversity as we can. And we know this, right? We have, you know, if you just think about urban trees and the urban tree canopy and all the benefits. So we have heat regulation, we have safety. There's some interesting studies about crime reduction when there's better tree canopy. We have, again, recreation. We have interception of rainfall. All these different services that are being generated just by trees in the urban setting. Let's plant more trees, right? And we've been negligent and in that we've neglected underserved communities. So I think we have an obligation to think about these areas that are underserved and to try to make right where we've not done the proper thing previously. And so we need to invest, maybe over-invest in these underserved and underutilized areas and increase that quality of life so that people aren't dying in these places, so that we have healthy communities, we have those ecosystem services, we have that open space that's high quality and only a 10-minute walk. So that we should aspire to be able to achieve these types of things. And I think that's long overdue, and we're trying to spend more and more time thinking about this and being intentional, thoughtful, creative, and collaborative with those communities to provide things that haven't been provided historically. So I'm going to leave you with a couple of thoughts. You know, not changing is not an option. And then in this comprehensive planning exercise that you're in the midst of right now, the most strategic scenario for growth, and you're taking on growth, Raleigh's growing. That's good, I think, but it's like, how are you going to grow? And so it needs to include everyone. So my hat's off to the city and their staff who are having inclusive dialogue like this. It's hard to get people out to listen and to participate. It's super important. And it's really important to go to where the communities are instead of asking them to come to you. And so again, I take my hat off to the city and the job that you're doing with that. It's really hard. It's really hard to engage. People's lives are busy, but you got to do it. So I think we need to plan and design for people. We need to plan and design for nature. And we need to plan and design for people in nature. And then the last thing I'll leave you with, and I know you can't read this, and I can barely read it in front of me here, but a coworker and friend of mine, we struggle with all this stuff at Biohabitats and try to figure out how our mission is to restore the earth and inspire ecological stewardship. So it's lofty, it's difficult to try and get there, but I think our crew, we never give up on that mission, and we're committed to it. And so my colleague said, the earth is an organism that needs expansive wilderness to regulate climate and support biodiversity. Cities are systems dependent on subsidized resource inputs. We are living organisms that respond to living systems for our mental health and our well-being. That's biophilia. As the world grows more populated, we must make cities function like ecosystems to produce life so that we can let the wild be wild. So I know that's pretty high up there in terms of like a thought, particularly when you're in an urban place. But I guess I challenge you that we have a global challenge and you have a local opportunity to start to meet those global challenges right here and to make a difference. And I'm optimistic that this effort can lead to outcomes like that. I challenge you all as you move forward with the endeavor to work cooperatively, to listen, actively listen, which we struggle with these days, and to work together to build healthy, vibrant, productive communities. I think you can do it. Thank you.
Thanks, Ted. All right, if you have questions for Ted, please write them on the colored note paper and pass them to the outer edges. Yeah, there should be note paper at the end of each aisle. Yeah. So, Dory, do we have a question for Ted?
Yes.
Whoa, you're my corpse.
They're very similar. I think that's why, a couple of things. That's why the city of Raleigh, I think, looks to other programs that may be doing some innovative things and then making an assessment, an evaluation of whether or not that would work here. And then another example would be, I'll go back to the Chesapeake Bay, and we've had some conversations about this, but there's a whole suite of practices, restoration practices that might be considered alternative that right now aren't approved in the state of North Carolina and therefore in the city of Raleigh, that I think serve as good precedent because they've been tested at a certain level to have efficacy that might allow the city of Raleigh or the state of North Carolina to adapt it sooner than to have to go through their same verification process. Now, maybe the state should go faster than they are currently, and that's something to work for. But I think because some of the issues are so similar, it should make it easier to learn from other areas that might be out in front in certain arenas and take those lessons learned and be better right away.
Please tell us about success stories you've seen with MS4s partnering with NGOs.
Oh, wow. I mean, I think they are countless. The biggest example might be where you have a large number of watershed organizations, because their focus tends to be watershed health. And so when there is an entity that is a watershed organization, and it tends to be a smaller scale, 10 to 100 square miles type of organization, might have full-time staff, would be useful. Then you see a lot of partnerships because those watershed organizations, those NGOs, are able to go and effectively chase grants from groups like National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, the acronym NWFW, we call it NIFWIF. I probably got that wrong. I said NFWF, NIFWIF, right? Or in Maryland, we're lucky because we have some other entities like the Chesapeake Bay Foundation or the Chesapeake Bay Trust. It's hard to keep them straight, but they all have money that they're looking to give out in grants. So when the municipality partners with the NGO to be a partner in that grant, that's a strong, compelling argument to the grantors to give those monies. You can do it, again, with the workforce development. Again, to access, say, HUD department type funding or other federal agencies that help the municipality get access to other funding sources that they might not otherwise traditionally have access to. So it's about being creative, building those relationships. The NGO also can deliver the projects. So they can be going out and partnering with the private sector, delivering a project that the municipality can then take credit for, so long as the project is meeting a certain set of standards. And that happens a ton in the state of Maryland. And we're involved in a lot of those types of projects. I think that's happening down, and Hunter, you'd have to help me out, but like in Nags Head, North Carolina, the Nature Conservancy is partnering with the private sector, and the city of Nags Head, or town of Nags Head, is benefiting from that NGO relationship with the private sector that's delivering projects. I don't know that it's necessarily going directly towards Nags Head's permit per se, but it's making problems in Nags Head go away. Shoreline erosion's occurring. They're delivering living shoreline projects. Those types of opportunities, I think, are prevalent if you're creative and if you build the relationships.
How can stormwater requirements influence development patterns in land use? For example, do they make sprawling suburban developments cheaper than dense developments?
That's a great question. So they probably can have an unintended consequence, but I'm going to go back to the private sector and challenge us in the private sector. We better be better at designing challenging sites to meet a community's goal from a development standpoint instead of going the easy route. We better be just as committed to improving the community as the people living in the community, because theoretically we're living in the community as well. So we shouldn't go and look for the easy way out, putting pressure on us, okay? We need to get better at designing practices that fit in tighter spots, that are lower in maintenance requirements, and meet water quality and water quantity challenges and requirements that are facing us. And we've got to try and work towards doing it in more cost-effective ways. There's probably a regulatory component of that, of review and approve of those types of things, so that when innovation is presented to a reviewer, they can embrace that innovation and not say, oh no, you can't do this. So we got to do some give and take there, and we're not very good at it, if I were to be, I think, an honest judge of that. But I think the opportunity to do it is there, and I think like if we don't do that, then, and I've always said this, then I think we're going to have a bunch of mediocre watersheds in terms of the quality of the watersheds, because we're just going to have, you know, dispersed development everywhere, and then all of our watersheds are going to stink, and we're going to have a lower quality of life as a result. And our health and our wellness is going to degrade along with that. And I mean, there's a cascade of problems with that, right? More traffic, more traffic, you know, less time with family. The list can go on and on. Ask them hard questions.
Can you talk about green job initiatives and creating jobs in urban communities, for examples where it's lacking?
Well, I think it's lacking generally. I think it's more the exceptions that I'm aware of. Maybe others have better examples. But that Prince George's County example I gave you, that it was one of the conditions of that contract, which was to actually to start green businesses. So that might be a landscaping company that's going to maintain all of the right-of-way bioswales. It might be a construction company that's going to be a startup that's going to start constructing a component of those bioswales or the other green stormwater infrastructure elements. So that was a requirement of that contract, to promote and to build local workforces through business startups, to hiring, and there was a minority component to that as well. So it was pretty innovative, pretty aspirational, and I think they've been pretty successful. I don't know all the data there. And then there's kind of the lower tier, but still important, I think, is, you know, in this age of digital, everybody, particularly young people, have their face in their phones, you know, and are less and less outside in natural settings. They might be doing active recreation activities, but less and less walking, hiking, biking, just getting people's hands dirty, right? And so that youth workforce, youth conservation corps, that concept, I think could be and has taken off in Howard County, Maryland. It's been a slog. It's been hard because, I mean, I don't want to overly judge our young people, but it's hard work when it's hot and humid in the summer, and you're out there weeding a bioretention cell, or you're raking mulch when you might be able to be behind a computer getting paid the same amount or more. But nonetheless, I think there is an opportunity to have a whole summer jobs program. We know that to be the case, and they can graduate and learn certain skills, particularly if higher ed isn't their calling, right? And so it's kind of like jobs training and skilled labor kind of building going on, and those opportunities there in the green kind of infrastructure arena.
Next comprehensive plan is expected to provide guidance for the next 2 decades. What do you anticipate will be the biggest climate-related impacts related to stormwater in the next 20 years?
Wow. I mean, I think I think we can be sure there's going to be catastrophic events, unfortunately, that are going to happen annually. If I were to guess, I'd say we're going to have lives lost due to large-scale flooding events easily every year. Hopefully not as severe as Helene, but it wouldn't surprise me. And so I think I guess there's two things with climate change that come to mind. One is at the coastal area and at the larger river floodplain level where we've encroached in both of those zones. I think we need to think about retreat. And that's super tough in historic towns like Asheville and Western North Carolina that have been there for a couple hundred years. Talk to the people in New Orleans. They don't want to move out of the Ninth Ward, right? That's where their family, their roots go back to. It's super emotional, really hard. But the reality is we should start thinking about retreating. Coastal, I think, I'm not as sympathetic. Maybe I'm naive about that. I'm not as sympathetic because a lot of times those are second homes. They didn't maybe pay attention in the first place, and it was just aggressive growth. They're going to get what's coming to them, I'm afraid. I mean, I don't mean that in a spiteful way, but I think that begets retreat as well, creating dune systems to absorb those energies. Otherwise, you're just going to rebuild, and that is insanity to me. It may not be to everybody, but that's insanity. The second thing is a shift and dramatic drop in biodiversity. And I'm not an ecologist, so I'm kind of channeling my ecologist colleagues, but that's an existential threat to us when we have extinctions of thousands of species going on, and that's going to result in epidemics and blight and drought and all of these other types of impacts because we've lost our biodiversity. And so that's a real concern.
Thanks, Ted.
Can you share some education examples of
Dory, we're out of time for questions right now. But we really appreciate those of you who submitted questions, and we will, there's some opportunities to chat with staff on the way out. We really appreciate you coming out tonight. You got a program, it's got a QR code on it. That is a survey that talks about stormwater priorities, and there's some free response parts of that, so we definitely want to hear what you're thinking about. We have some upcoming events. So as was mentioned, on Monday, December 9th, so this coming Monday, right in this room, we're going to talk about the state of stormwater in the city. Reverend Jermont Taylor, who's the chair of the Stormwater Management Advisory Commission, and I see we have some commission members here today. Thank you. And Wayne Miles, who's our stormwater program manager, will be talking about that. And then we're going to be sitting at tables and discussing these issues as small groups. We also have some what we call Ask a Planner events if you want to talk to staff one-on-one about concerns. And those are, I believe, listed in the program. There's one coming up in December and then two in January. And stay tuned for additional communication about the other community conversations. So we're talking about stormwater now, but there'll be future conversations about trees, mobility, and neighborhood change. So thank you all for coming out, and thank you, Ted, for coming down to join us.